Good morning. I'm Andrew Selee. I'm the president of the Migration Policy Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, How Latin America is Responding to the Venezuelan Exodus. It's no secret to those of you at this webinar that more than 3 million Venezuelans have left their country, at least 2 million of them in the past 3 years, if not more. Some projections put it as high as 5 million Venezuelans may be out of their country at the end of next year if current flows continue. This is one of the fastest and largest migration flows in the world. It is one that has not received sufficient attention yet, and it hasn't received sufficient attention in part because it's been managed fairly well by the recipient countries. 80% of the Venezuelans who have left their homeland have gone to other countries in Latin America. And we're here today to talk about the regional response, which has been quite proactive with some of the actors involved in this process. There has been relatively less mobility within Latin America until this moment. There's been lots of mobility through legal flows and occasionally regular flows throughout Latin America and throughout South America, but nothing on this scale until recently. And countries have responded with enormous creativity and enormous proactivity on this. We have seen an attempt in most countries and certainly in the 3 countries that have received the largest number of Venezuelans, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, to try and find ways of allowing people into the country and allowing them to integrate into the country, to have legal status, to be able to work, to be able to access public services. This is partially an act of solidarity, but it is also a practical realization that it is better to have people who are immigrants in the country in legal status and able to participate in society than to have them in the shadows. And indeed, I occasionally say to people, there's much that the rest of us in the rest of the world could learn from what is happening in some of these countries. For those of us that are from the United States and Europe listening on this line, I mean, it's not only a chance to learn of what's happening in Latin America, but I think there's also a chance for us to learn a little bit from some creative responses that have happened there. That said, there is, of course, tensions that rise when you have a migration flow this large. There is a backlash in some places with a scale this big, and international cooperation will be absolutely fundamental to make sure that the gates that have been open stay open and that this continues to be a successful experience, because otherwise there can be a real backlash. We're very fortunate to have with us representatives of 3 governments, of the 3 governments that have received most of the Venezuelans. I will introduce them in a few minutes. Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Colombia has over 1 million, perhaps by the end of the year, as many as 1.2 million according to official figures, and maybe closer to 1.5 million in some people's estimation of Venezuelans. Peru has 550 to 600,000. Ecuador, 250, 280,000. You'll hear this from the high-level representatives from these governments, as well as Feline Freier, a distinguished scholar who I'll introduce in a minute as well. First of all, housekeeping notes. Let's just the technical questions for those of you participating, because this is important. The audio from the webinar will be on our website later today at migrationpolicy.org/events. If you have any technical problems with today's webcast, please email us at events@migrationpolicy.org or call us at 202-266-1929. If you have problems hearing the webcast, you can also use the dial-in number, the call-in information that was sent when you got the confirmation email. We will not have voice questions, but we will have a question and answer period after the speakers speak, and you can type any questions directly into the Q&A part of the chat box on the right side of your screen. Or you can also tweet your questions at us, always good to tweet at people, at Migration Policy or hashtag MPI Discuss. I should point out that MPI has been working assiduously on the issue, on questions of legal status and integration, and simply data on the number of Venezuelans moving throughout the hemisphere. We have 2 reports that you can find on our migration information source, one by Feline Freier, who you'll hear from shortly, and her colleague Nicholas Parent, called A South American Migration Crisis, Venezuelan Outflows, Test Neighbors Hospitality, and one by the distinguished Venezuelan scholar Tomás Páez, who I was actually emailing with this morning, Amid Economic Crisis and Political Turmoil, Venezuelans Form a New Exodus. Without further ado, let me turn to our speakers. Let me start. We're going to go geographically. We needed a way of figuring out among such eminent speakers, and we really appreciate all of you being willing to join us, by the way, to the speakers here. I mean, this is quite a distinguished group to get all in one place at one time, so thank you. Let me start by introducing Felipe Muñoz. Felipe Muñoz is the Gerente de Fronteras, the manager for borders of the Colombian government and an advisor to the President of Colombia. He has a long and distinguished history in both the international sector, where he was at the IDB as executive director, senior counsel for the executive director at the IDB, but he also ran at one point the Colombia's largest security organization, security agency, and he also has a distinguished career in the private sector. So without further ado, I'm going to do a very quick introduction so we can get to things. Felipe, it's my great pleasure to turn it over to you. You've been one of the leaders on trying to make sure that this flow, which has been rapid and unexpected, has really been able to be absorbed in Colombia in a way that benefits both Colombians and those arriving. Tell us what you're doing, Felipe.
Thank you, Andrew. I would like to start by thanking you and the Migration Policy Institute for setting up this event. And I'd also like to greet my fellow panelists, Ambassador Carrión, Roxana, the Superintendent of Migration of Peru, and the Professor Freier. And I'm really happy to be here just to share our thoughts with all of you. And let me start just to remind for all the people who are hearing us that the Venezuelan crisis has sparked a situation that is new for the region as a whole. And we need to have a better understanding of how it works and how the country receiving the majority of the population, as you have mentioned before, like Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, can make the best out of it. The Colombian government response, as well as that from the population, has been and will continue to be generous and welcoming. Colombians have stepped up to the challenge and through their solidarity and responsibility have coped with one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. But we cannot do it alone. By international standards, the Venezuelan migration crisis, as you have mentioned before also, is one of the most severe. In terms of numbers, it is comparable only to Turkey or Bangladesh. According to the Colombian Migration Authority, as of September the 30th, more than 1 million Venezuelans were in our country. In addition, an estimated 350,000 Colombians have returned from Venezuela. Of those currently residing in Colombia, almost 500,000 are now under regular migratory status through a temporary measure created by the government, also known as PEP, which stands for Special Residence Permit, which allows them to stay in a regular manner for a period of 2 years. Another 1.6 million enter and leave the country through the border in a circular migration. They live in Venezuela but get food and medicines in Colombia. But another 650,000 have entered through the border with Venezuela and on occasions literally walk to the border with Ecuador to reach other countries in the southern part of the hemisphere. The impact of this massive migration in Colombia has been complex and costly. Initial estimates by the World Bank and a local think tank suggest an annual cost of between 0.2% to 0.42% of GDP, depending on the number of new Venezuelans being considered. And the main challenge, as it's obvious, fall on the health, education, urban development, security, and vulnerable populations. Just to give you some numbers, just in 2018 alone, more than 100,000 Venezuelans have received attention in Colombian hospitals, an increase of more than 320% when you compare this figure with 2017. And close to 650,000 vaccines have been applied, 83% of them to children under 5. Increases in high-cost diseases such as AIDS and cancer have put an additional strain on the sector's scarce resources. Or measles and diphtheria, which have been eradicated in Colombia, reviving. More than 30,000 children and teenagers have been enrolled in public schools now in Colombia, where they receive 2 meals and transportation to get to and from class. And more than 55,000 children and teenagers have also received some sort of assistance from the welfare programs targeted at this vulnerable population. During the initial stage, grasping the dimension of the situation, identified and created the necessary migratory tools and prioritizing the humanitarian response were the main elements. But after August the 8th, with the incoming administration, the Colombian government, under the leadership of President Duque, has now built a comprehensive policy to ensure we achieve the goal of integrating those who are residing in Colombia and the ones that will come in the future. And let me just mention very briefly the three main pillars for this policy. The regulatory pillar, recently the government released a white paper, also known as a compass, that sets an initial route for the detention of the migrants, consolidates statistics, and unifies procedures. But the most important, it establishes migration as an opportunity for Colombia's growth in the future. Also, two law projects are in works about migration and border integration to update the legal framework for the new and complex scenario Colombia is currently in. And finally, the National Development Plan, a medium to long-term strategy devised by the government in which elements to integrate the migrant population are included. The second pillar is the financial one, and resources for the national budget, which are by far the largest source of funding for the response. But also, we are looking for a multilateral financial platform. We are working with the World Bank, with the IDB, and with the CAF, and we are trying to currently building, based on concessional funds and some donations, just a financial platform. And also, we are receiving for international dollars some international cooperation, especially, and we want to thank the government of the United States. We are grateful for that, but it's still largest insufficient. And finally, an institutional pillar made up. We are trying to take the best practices and knowledge in the world. We are creating a communications strategy, as migration is communications, and we are creating a top-down coordination through a creation of an office I currently run to articulate the national response from presidency. And a bottom-up coordination through local migration tables we have set up in 13 cities, including Bogota, Cali, Medellin, and other cities along the border. And one key element that runs through all the pillars is an effort to increase the involvement of international community. We just want to reiterate three final ideas. First, reiterate the President Duque's and the Society of Colombia commitment to integrate Venezuelan migrants and to make an opportunity out of what is now a very, very difficult situation. Second, we need to emphasize that this situation cannot be solved by one country alone. We need to join our efforts, and this is why we salute the common stand we have taken as a region, and we fully support the work we are undertaking with Ecuador and Peru under the Quito process, and with some agreement we have reached with Peru on sharing migration information. This situation is unprecedented, it's a scope unparalleled in the region, and it continues to be one of the most severe globally. Governments must be prepared to respond to a twofold increase in the current migration population according to the most optimistic forecast. And finally, it is no longer about humanitarian assistance, but about a development challenge to the countries and to the region. Even if conditions inside Venezuela change tomorrow, the recovery will take years. We must take a medium and long-term view in this process. And finally, the solution to this crisis needs to be tailored to Latin American needs. The answers that work in Turkey or Lebanon, for example, will not work for Peru or Chile. The legal tools of sectoral policy to face this crisis require that the countries in the region, international donors, multilateral banks, but even think tanks as Migration Policy Institute, help us to assess different toolkits that those used for Europe, Asia, or Middle East. And we'd like to reiterate our thanks to Migration Policy Institute for this event. And just to request you, we continue discussing about ideas to better shape our effort to integrate Venezuelan migrants and Colombian returning fully to our society. We are more than glad to receive any knowledge or to sharing our experience on best practices that will help us to achieve our goal.
Thank you, Felipe. That was fabulous. I mean, you really set the stage here. That was incredibly clear, compelling, concise, and you really laid out the issues. It's my pleasure to turn to Ambassador Francisco Carrión, my neighbor here in Washington. He is Ecuador's ambassador here to the United States, but he has also been foreign minister, deputy foreign minister, ambassador to the United Nations, and to several other countries. Ambassador Carrión.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and congratulations to the MPI for organizing this event. That is, I think, quite important and at the same time quite timely. What can I say first? Some general ideas. I think, well, I was really concerned with this issue because I was a member of the Committee on Migrant Workers of the Convention of the UN, and that gave me the opportunity to understand this whole phenomena. And at the same time, I was ambassador to Spain when Ecuador suffered the phenomenon of thousands of Ecuadorians that fled from Ecuador because of economic crisis. Well, I would like to propose some general ideas. First of all, we have to consider that migration is a phenomenon. It's not a problem. It's a phenomenon with problems that have to be solved or at least deal with. Most people think that migration is a problem. No, it isn't. It's a phenomenon. It's a human phenomenon that has been present during all history. And that's very important to have in mind. Concretely, Ecuador has been a country of immigration as well as immigration. What I mean by that, we have some times in which Ecuadorians have left the country, and in other cases, people came from other countries to Ecuador. In this first decade of the century, we have what I was telling about the Ecuadorians leaving Ecuador because of the economic crisis, especially to Europe and mainly to Spain. But now we have become a country of immigration. That means people coming to Ecuador, and that's the case first of Colombians and now of Venezuelans. Since 2014 until now, we have received at least 800,000 Venezuelans in Ecuador. We have to tell and be clear that Ecuador welcomes without discrimination every person, and that's in our constitution, every person that is in human mobility situation. That's the expression that our constitution uses. It is a country with most refugees in Latin America, and we have to distinguish migration from refugee. And that's very, very important because, as you all members of this panel know, the legal status of refugees is different than migrants. But that's why we have to adequate our pragmatic and public policies aim to protect foreigners and settle in our territory, regardless of their national origin and migratory status. Some relevant information I would like to share with you about the international protection actions that Ecuador has granted. Since 1990, Ecuador has received around 220,000 requests for international protection. That means refugees presented, and it was in its vast majority, more than 90%, by Colombian citizens. Ecuador has recognized the refugee status for more than 65,000 people, of whom 98%, more than 62,000, were Colombian citizens. At the same time, you can imagine, because regarding statistics in migration, refugees, and others, are not quite real because it is about people that don't have necessary papers. That's why it's very difficult to tell and to say numbers regarding this phenomenon. Ecuador, well, at the same time, established a way to deal with this phenomenon in our country. Regarding the Venezuelan migration, since, as I said, since 2014, the massive Venezuelan migration to the countries began. And according to the UNHCR and the International Organization of Migration, the OIM, more than 2.5 million Venezuelan citizens have left their country of origin in the last 4 years. 90% of them went to 3 countries, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Venezuelan citizens can stay in Ecuador, and that's very important to take into account, for up to 6 months as tourists. If they want to stay longer, and that is the case for many of them, they must apply for a temporary resident visa or a permanent resident visa. Most of the visas granted to Venezuelan citizens have the category called the visas UNASUR. These visas can grant a temporary residence status. Since 2014, more than 1,250,000 Venezuelan citizens have entered Ecuador, being only 750,000 in this year, from which more than 250,000 Venezuelan citizens remain in Ecuador. To regularize this situation, Ecuador has granted more than 97,000 visas to Venezuelans. That means a lot, nearly half of the Venezuelans that have arrived to Ecuador. As of October of this year, Ecuador implemented the electronic visa, which will speed up the process of granting these documents. It is estimated that 80% of the beneficiaries of this new system will be Venezuelan citizens. Regarding international protection, in the last 2 years, Ecuador has received approximately 9,100 requests for refugee by Venezuelan citizens, of which 1,700 have been admitted for processing. This contrasts with the high number of Colombians who have requested the refugee in the same period. That means 8,000, almost 9,000 of which have been admitted. The massive migration of Venezuelan citizens to other countries objectively exceeds the capacity of the absorption and responsible attention to the population concerned, which requires the financial and technical contribution of the international community. In the case of Ecuador, the current financing provided by the international community to the protection program does not cover more than 5% of the needs, which are estimated at more than 100 million. So one aspect that is very important to take into account are the initiatives that Ecuador had implied to the treatment of this subject. First, at the national level, we have so far 4 meetings of the National Human Mobility Board of Ecuador to evaluate and address the problems associated with the migration phenomenon. The National Human Mobility Board has 7 intersectoral human mobility tables that have been working on the issue in the whole different factors of this phenomenon. Between the main elements that we treated in these tables, it is worth to mention the implementation of humanitarian corridor. That means we have helped because we have to be aware that many of the Venezuelans that came to Ecuador don't stay in Ecuador. They wanted to go through Ecuador and cross our country to get to Peru. We have implemented the humanitarian corridor. The entry into the territory of Ecuador of children, adolescents, and Venezuelans nationality who do not have the identity and or travel documents was considered, especially because of their condition. We have as well work with the, of course, the public health ministry regarding the health of these people. We have collected information regarding them to help and to permit their access to our country. We have worked through the Minister of Foreign Affairs as well in the organization of the necessary regional approach to this phenomenon. The Ministry of Human Affairs and Human Mobility, that's the name of the ministry, has so far organized 2 meetings with countries of the region to address the problems associated with the massive migration of Venezuelan citizens. We have had in September the first one, where the Declaration of Quito on Human Mobility of Venezuelan Citizens was adopted, and the second meeting regarding the Plan of Action of Human Mobility of Venezuelan nationals in the region. We also had last November the international donors table, states, international organizations, the U.S. of course, United Nations, and the World Bank of course, and other multilateral organizations to be present to finally help gathering money to make a regional approach. And of course, in the case of Ecuador, that is the country which more impact has received because of the dimension of its economy and population.
Ambassador,
thank you very much.
Thank you. That's fabulous, and that is something we'll come back to, I'm sure, in the Q&A, because Ecuador has played a leadership role in this Quito process that's been very important. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Frieda Roxana del Águila Tuesta, the Superintendent of and General Manager of Peru's National Migration Agency. She has extensive experience in public administration, has held several leadership positions within the Peruvian government, and has always focused on improving innovation, processes, and technology to obtain better budgetary results and better outcomes for citizens, and in this case has been working hard, first as the Deputy Superintendent, now as the Superintendent, to try and modernize Peru's migration services to be able to deal with this significant inflow of Venezuelans. She's an attorney and holds a PhD in law as well, or a doctorate in law and a doctorate in philosophy. Roxana, go ahead, Dr. del Águila.
Good morning for everybody. We want to start to say we don't have border with Venezuela, but like just Ecuador, we didn't have immigration experience. So the massive migration crisis posed major challenges for received countries, among them finding appropriate mechanisms to insert migrants into society of the labor market. In the last 3 years, Peru and the region have witnessed an apparent migration phenomenon generated by the deepening of the political and economic crisis in Venezuela. So we didn't have this kind of experience, but we saw how the people that come here to Peru and due to the various factors in Venezuela, the legal, economic, different situation, and from since 2016 in Peru, there was an increase the number of Venezuelan citizens who remain in the national territory beyond the period of authorized stays. So that means they start to be here like 1 year without status because they pass all this tourist status. To incorporate them in the Peru economic and society, we create one style of the position in migration like we call PTP. It's a temporal permit for permanence. Was created in here first in this superintendent. And the legal mechanisms now they permit the regulation of migration status of Venezuelan citizens for the period of 1 year. After that, they can be resident in our country. So they receive different kind of help, and with 3 kind of laws. Was first in 2017, 2 times, and the last one was in 2018. So the PTP is a legal mechanism to already exist also in different countries. I mean, Colombia also have the PEP similar like us. The PTP is the one innovation initiative of Peru to arise from the need regulation Venezuela migrants and the foreign parents for Peruvian children who have been abandoned by the then Peruvian national couples. So we give this protection for them. The PTP was the value of the International American Commission on Human Rights like an example of the region. In July 2017, Colombia activates also this kind of the PTP. For us, was the facility of the service is in online. The dating mechanism was established for the started. So the Venezuelan migrants don't have to wait long lines on the migration office. They wait in the offices. So we open for after 6 o'clock for all the institutions. It starts to be like a waiting room for all them because we are working for the Venezuelan now 24 hours per day. Since May 2018, the service was activated with this being 24 hours for Monday to Saturday in Lima headquarters and since November in 6 zonal headquarters. So that means all now possibilities of them to make regulation in different parts of Peru because we work now 24 hours in the national. Of the 4,070 daily appointments have been made available in Venezuelan people to process for the PTP. In this office, we receive 4,700 persons. This is very important because they can, with this one, we can make so quickly this attention for them. Migration expanded the capacity of the headquarters, converting spaces that were warehouses in archiving and in attention room. It's even enabled in special attention with the children, accompanied with the parents. We prepare one special room for the kids. They receive all attention, including the Venezuelan help us to make it for them to pass good time when they're waiting with the parents. Also, they receive here a vaccination of 5 kind of sickness, so this is free. So they have all these kind of possibilities here. They have a possibility to work, they have the possibility to study, and also to the health. If we question, for example, how many Venezuelan migrants have a PTP, first of all, we have more than 600,000 Venezuelans in Peru. 150,000 have the PTP card. More than 200,000 have already started in process, and they still also to be present in like Interpol documents. We have more than 104,000 appointments available to attend procedures in Venezuela who entered until October 31 last. who can start their application with the last day of 2018. So that means we finish this December with this kind of possibility, but we receive all all Venezuelan citizens, like a refugee and like a tourist. Now we don't exist in that moment the visa of this. They come in entrance to our country without this kind of document. We have more than 100,000, like I told you. About the attention with the talking of facilities access to the labor maker to those Venezuelans who don't yet have Interpol change, we give one special document. So they come here, they take the picture, all the biometric information, and after that, in few minutes, they can print this document from his computer. And with this computer, with this document, they can, in that moment, have a label. So they can go to one employee and to show them, and this employee can open our web and to can see this is original. So these 600,000 Venezuela who have now PTP, it is extraordinary permission, provisional work. In this document of to work, they can be working 60 days plus again other 60 days if they don't can have this Interpol document, so they can work any the formal style here in Peru. About the composition of the benefits of the PTP, 58%, 58.3% they have procedure of PTP. More is men, 41.7%, and 41.7% are women, and 10% of all them they are minors. So I repeat, 58.3% is men, and 41.7% are women, and 10% are minors. 80.5% was registration with passport, and 11% was with identification card ID in Peru. So the capital of Lima, or the province of Callao, have 92.2% registration Venezuelan citizens. So that means all concentration is here in Lima. This document and additional improving the living condition of these migrants allow the Peruvian state to have valuable information from Venezuelan migrants to implement police. The information collect of immigration essential of the implementation of political public on education, health, work, production, territorial organization, among others. What is important because when they make application to have appointment, they have to fill about 40 questions. So about the condition, about the work, about how much experience having the kind of the professional, if they are alone, how they live, if they live with a family, if they live with other kind of person, how many persons live in this house. So we start to ask about all these questions because we want to have information to check how is the procedure, how they can be in the with the time they have more quality of the life here.
That's excellent.
This is very important because migration office give all the information for all the states. So to try to provide much better condition for them. So not just one document, also the health, all this vaccination. It's also we have here in one office for some people who need a special because they are with a special problem of the health. In that moment, we don't give PTP. We did immediately one ID of residents. With this, they can go to the hospital. They can have the special help in different institutions of state. This is we have already around 6,000 persons who receive this resident card. They don't have to apply or to wait 1 year to go to this special attention. For,
That's great.
with this one, we help around 10,000 families. Also, we give this information because a lot of people of them they have at the end also cancer or different things. Also for the pregnant woman, in that moment we give this registration or ID, so they have really like a resident here in Peru, and they can receive all our help. So in this December end, this is the end for the people can apply for the PTP. So also we can see how in the border it started to be more each day, more people coming into our country. They apply for refugee or they apply for tourists, but then they say mayor they say they have the parents or the family or the husband or wife here. We need to be together like a family because we give the support of all them. This is what we are doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We will come back to you in the question and answer. I want to turn to Feline Freier. Professor Feline Freier is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the Universidad del Pacífico. She currently leads an interdisciplinary research team on the socioeconomic integration of Venezuelan migrants and refugees. She also represents civil society on the interministerial roundtable hosted by the Peruvian Foreign Ministry, and she holds a PhD in political science from London School of Economics and wrote one of the articles in the Migration Information Source of the Migration Policy Institute. So glad to have Feline with us today. And Feline, give us your perspective.
Yes, thank you very much, Andrew. It's a great pleasure and honor to be joining you and my fellow panelists. I'll try to be very brief to give some time for the Q&A as well, but I did want to point out some of the major challenges I see both for the migration management and for the protection of Venezuelan forcibly displaced across the region. So what I always, and I think this has been said by my fellow panelists, I think it's really important, especially in cross-regional comparison, to point out how generous Latin American countries have been and continue to be in the reception of Venezuelan displaced. I think the three other panelists also pointed to the creativity, in coming up with special visas and special protection mechanisms for Venezuelans, but that's already my first point of concern. And this was raised, the question of which kind of flow we're actually looking at was raised by Felipe and Francisco as well. The question whether these are migrants or refugees. And here we need to understand that Latin American countries, 15 Latin American countries, all of the countries concerned with these inflows right now, have incorporated into their national domestic legislation the definition of refugee of Cartagena. This definition was actually developed in the context of another Central American refugee crisis or displacement crisis in the 1980s, and it's important to understand that it entails a broader definition of who is or should be considered a refugee. So whereas the UN 51 Convention really focuses on personal persecution, the definition of Cartagena also includes those persons who have fled their country because their lives, security, or freedom have been threatened by generalized violence, foreign aggression, internal conflicts, massive violation of human rights, or other circumstances which have seriously disturbed the public order. Again, this definition is law in all of the countries we're talking about. And from an academic or civil society perspective, we are really pushing for the application of the definition of Cartagena to the Venezuelan displaced. If we have a look at statements of governments, at the statements of the Inter-American Court for Human Rights, the Organization of American States, especially when we think about massive violations of human rights or generalized violence, these are things countries in the region are concerned about and identify as such. What would be the difference? Why does it matter whether we apply Cartagena or not? And here again, countries have been extremely generous. Also, Roxana did a really great job at explaining to us how Peru, for example, has been creative in making the management of the inflow more efficient once Venezuelans arrive in Peru. the problem with these special visas is that they're limited in time, right? So Roxana also mentioned that the PTP has basically run out. People that arrive in Peru right now cannot apply for the PTP anymore. They can apply for refugee status. What is happening right now in many countries is that cases or the applications are simply not decided upon. So in Peru right now, we have 150,000 asylum seekers, and their cases are not being decided. That gives them minimum protection. But there are two main problems. First of all, in some areas, such as access to healthcare, refugees would have better access to healthcare, and that brings me to a third point I'll come to in a second, which has been made also by the other panelists, how important it will be that we really focus on international cooperation to address this crisis. But if we stay with the protection of Venezuelans for a second, so first point is that refugee status would give them another level of protection, especially when we think about access to healthcare. And second of all, we're already seeing xenophobic backlashes in the region. We're seeing how public opinion is changing, and my great concern is that this issue of Venezuelan displacement will become a political issue. So immigration has not been a political issue for Latin American countries in the past decades. This is changing, and my great concern is that this will become a political issue, and that public opinion and xenophobic sentiment might inform future policies, that with upcoming elections, we might see governments taking power that build their election campaigns on this question of immigration and xenophobia. And if Venezuelans are not recognized as refugees under Cartagena, it would be very easy for incoming governments to then decide cases negatively and send people back. Now, as Felipe Muñoz has pointed out, this is a medium-long-term crisis. So even if the situation in Venezuela would change tomorrow, the consequences of the crisis will still be felt for a couple of years. And I think we really need to think medium-long-term management of migration flows, but also medium-long-term, at least medium-term protection of forcibly displaced Venezuelans. And here, this brings me to the other point that has already been mentioned, the huge importance of regional cooperation and international cooperation. So no country in the region, and now I'm talking as a political scientist, will be the first to apply Cartagena if they do it alone, right? Because there's a great fear, an understandable fear might be that might be understood as an open invitation to, or even like an even more generous opening of doors, and politics and policy obviously also has to be pragmatic, and it has to be realistic, and no country, this is at least my assessment, would be willing to take this step alone. So here, regional cooperation, and I am aware that some countries in the region actually pushed for Cartagena in the last Quito meeting, where the issue of Venezuelan displacement was discussed last week or 2 weeks ago. Second of all, international cooperation. Obviously, applying Cartagena and accepting Venezuelan immigrants or forcibly displaced as refugees comes with a different cost. So it sounds beautiful, and it is important that Venezuelans have access to healthcare, but obviously in countries where large segments of the population, I'm thinking about Peru right now, are still without sufficient or adequate healthcare. It's a question of where to take the money from, right? So here, I'm very happy to see that the international community, the United Nations, has now already committed to funding programs in the region, and that this will be extremely important in the medium term, short and medium term. Another thing I wanted to point out is that cooperation and regional cooperation will also be very important. And again, Felipe, I think you spoke about the importance of cooperating with think tanks, universities, here I am, but also NGOs. And here, one point I wanted to make was that although the international cooperation and basically donations from the international community will be decisive to adequately and deal with the Venezuelan migration crisis, it will also be important to cooperate with NGOs and especially with local NGOs. Why am I saying this? Because the local NGOs are the ones that really have the know-how of the local context. They have experience working very often with internally displaced populations, such as the case of Colombia, but also in Peru. And it would be a pity not to take advantage of their know-how and to incorporate them in discussion. Civil society has been very active and has organized itself across countries. And here I just wanted to point out an action plan that was elaborated by more than 40 organizations under the coordination of Selee in Washington. And I would like to end on a positive note. As pointed out by Francisco, migration is a phenomenon. It's a phenomenon, that there is a lot of opportunities, even for forcibly displaced people, but also for the countries of destination. And I think here we can still learn a lot from one another. So if I take Peru as an example, so we have the next round of the DTM, which is a survey conducted by the IOM, is coming out next week. But the last data we have, which is a couple of months old, 60% of Venezuelans have a university or technical degree, right? So this is still, although these characteristics are changing, a highly qualified migration flow towards Peru. I know it's a little bit different in the case of Colombia, and it will be essential to make sure that these professionals can actually be productive in their professions. On a positive note, also thanks to an NGO which is called Unión para los Venezolanos in Peru, 30,000 highly qualified Venezuelans have registered, and I know that this NGO is cooperating with the government to see whether there could be a way of coming up with a program where these professionals can move out of Lima and into different regions in Peru in order to be productive and help develop the country in other regions, and to lessen a little bit the pressure that we now see in some sectors in Lima on wages and on the economy. On the negative side, maybe also a case of Peru, we have a law in place where all foreigners need to pay 30% tax in the first year they work formally in Peru. And I know that this is something that really keeps many Venezuelans from formalizing their situation, and there actually a lot of potential income is lost by the state because Venezuelans prefer not to not to regularize and not to seek formal employment because they cannot afford paying this 30% tax in the first year of working formally in Peru. So I know we're running out of time, so I'll end on this note, and I'm very happy to take questions in the Q&A.
Thank you, Feline, and thank you to all of our panelists. It's been a very fruitful conversation. I'm mindful there's a lot of questions that have come in, and so I'm going to read them all very briefly. I'm going to do an abbreviated version, and then we're going to go back to the panelists for 2-minute responses to the ones that they want to take. So someone asked about reports of figures. The International Organization on Migration, UNHCR, publish regular figures. If you go to either IOM or UNHCR, you can get the regular figures on the number of Venezuelans that are living outside their country and what countries they're in. There's also a good report for the American Dialogue, and we have one coming out in January from Migration Policy Institute with data as well, with much more drilled down data. Okay, here are the questions for our panelists, and we will let you respond to the ones you choose to. So I'm going to give them all at once to the panelists. Are these migrants or refugees? Feline talked about this already, but others may want to respond to this. Are there reasons for applying or not applying the Cartagena Declaration to all Venezuelans that are arriving? And then the specific question about are asylum systems working, and that was really directed about Colombia, so Felipe may want to address that, but it's also a good question for Peru and Ecuador. Are the asylum systems working as they should, or are they overwhelmed? But I'll come back. Let me give you a few more questions. Family reunification, what's being done in terms of family reunification? What about equivalency of professional degrees? Something Feline just mentioned at the end. You know, a lot of very qualified people. You know, how well is it working to be able to recognize doctors and dentists and teachers and others to be able to get them into their professions and maybe out of the capital cities? Another question from our good friend Diego Lopez, regional appeal, or Diego Chavez, sorry, Diego, regional appeal going on, or these country appeals for international aid? Has there been a corporate business response and co-responsibility on this. And finally, a question about the effect of the Venezuelan government not recognizing the crisis. Has that been a problem that the Venezuelan government denies this crisis in terms of their attention to respond to the, in terms of being able to deal with Venezuelan migration? Usually governments where people are leaving are active in reaching out to their diaspora. That doesn't always seem to be the case here. So we're going to go in the order we started. I'd ask you, to the panelists, to each keep it to 2 minutes. I know that's hard, but given the time we have, we may run about 5 minutes over if we have to, but no more than that. And let's start with Felipe. 2 minutes.
Andrew, thank you. I want to answer the last question. Of course, that the government of Venezuela don't recognize the crisis is immoral. And it's really hard for the countries just to try to help the people if they don't recognize that they have a very, very massive crisis. But, okay, this is another topic, and this is more political. But I just want to mention what Feline was mentioned about the refugee. Colombia respects the refugee and the asylum laws, international laws. Of course, in the internal legislation, we analyze case by case, on case-by-case basis. But of course, we know that we have to be open to consider all the legal options, and we are working on that. But for the internal legal consideration, for example, if you apply for an asylum status, you can't work. Then, as a government, we are trying just to create another legal protection measures that, of course, provide the people with all the social services and also for the protection. But, of course, we know that we have a mixed flux of migrants, some of them in need of protection, and we respect that. But the other majority in needs and another legal measures, and these are the measures that we are working in the last months. But, of course, we are open to discuss all this process, and we are really aware that we need to consider maybe transformation in our legal system.
Thank you, Felipe. That's great. Ambassador Carrión.
Yes. I will first agree with Felipe in the last, or the first question he answered regarding the position of the government of Venezuela. How can we deal with this huge problem without the participation of the country that people is coming from? That's very difficult. If they don't recognize the crisis, it's not easy to deal with the problem. And of course, the position that the government of President Maduro has taken makes things worse. Then I would like to clarify that migrants are not the same as refugees. Refugees are, well, it is an international statute that is given by ACNUR. Migrants are all people that are in human mobility, even though they don't have papers or they are in regular situation, and that's very important to take into account. And thirdly, there is no question about that, but I have to underline the impact of the Venezuelan migration to Ecuador regarding the size of our economy, and our population, because we have to take into account that we have already, 20 or 25 years ago, the migration from, and the refugees as well, from Colombia that are near 500,000 that are living in Ecuador. So for Ecuador, if you add, let's say, 400,000 Colombians living in Ecuador to the 800,000 Venezuelans, you can imagine how difficult it is for us to deal with the presence of such a number of migrants or refugees with the size, I insist, of Ecuadorian economy and the size of the Ecuadorian population.
Thank you, Ambassador. Much appreciated. Roxana, 2 minutes.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, yes. Yes, thank
Dr.
you
Del
for
Águila. Yes.
okay, thank you for the opportunity. I want to talk about the performance of the migration here. So we have a lot professionals. So with this system of the appointment, we receive all the information about the which is the performance of the people, which experience they have. We catch all this kind of information and we transfer this information for the Minister of Education. So this minister, they can give in, if they make tests or different some tests, something like that, they will receive the opportunity to work like with this professional, like a professional here in my country. So we give all opportunity for them. We need to make organization or territory organization of the people because the 92% is in Lima. So, but this is coming, in one moment. In this year, we received 500,000 persons. So we didn't be ready to catch this kind of the people, but we try to give all the possibilities for them. But really, it's too much in one moment. So we check other countries how they make with the migration, how they make to give this performance of document, and we saw it was not too much like we receive in one moment, but we give all this information of the appointments. With this one, we can give to Minister of Health, to Minister of Education, to Ministers of the Working Ministers, to the Labor, so they can now start to be slowly and introduce them performance in our economy. Plus, they can also to pay taxes if they are working already. So we don't have this. We don't force them to be like a resident, but after 1 year they can apply. They don't need to provide how much money they have, like what is one resident with different conditions. With this, after that, they can receive one special resident card after 1 year. With this one, they can be like a resident in Peru. So 2 years later, they can be employed Peruvian. So or immigrants. So with this, without kind of problem. So now the problem for us is the PTP. Some people who is in the procedure of the PTP, they are going to Venezuela to pick up the family. And when they come back, they lost this possibility to continue because they leave from the country. So now we are checking how they can help. We can help them for this situation because when we want to give this PTP, we can see they are already outside. So this is what we did about the refugee. This is the foreign minister who make all these things, and they are already received in the border all the people who wanted to be like who apply for refugee, and this they are checking the procedures. They think he said there are around 200,000 persons who have to check about if they can be refugee, but also migration. We know already they don't have this person for la political persecution. So with this one, we are now enroll all the biometric information when they pass the border control, because they know already they are not refugee. But with this one, we can make regulation later. So now we want to finish and to see how is the possibility to help them when they are already here to get this regulation of the like Venezuelans with citizens, And with this one, I think we will help all them.
Thank you. That's great, Roxana. And finally, Feline, you have the last 2 minutes for you, and then I will, in 30 seconds, answer a couple of questions that may not get answered. There's another question for you about xenophobia, also in Peru. So if you want to add that to your 2 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So what I would like to emphasize once more is that Cartagena really is a border. It's a border definition. So it's not just the personal political persecution. It's people that flee the conditions in the country. Yeah, and we're talking about massive human rights violations in Venezuela. We're talking about generalized violence, and there certainly is a situation where the public order has collapsed. And what's also special about Cartagena is that countries do have the possibility to apply it as a group definition. So in law, I think that's called prima facie, right? So it could be applied to all Venezuelans without going through the personalized process. That said, I think it's also true that not all Venezuelans want to be recognized as refugees, because that implies a number of things. For example, that you cannot return to Venezuela, or you lose your refugee status if you return to Venezuela. So I think it's also really important and great that countries in the region are thinking about alternative regularization processes or visas. At the same time, I would also like to stress that refugees, just as migrants, don't necessarily have to be a burden for the economy, right? I think this is a little bit, this image refugees have, especially in the context of the European welfare state. But in the case of most Latin American countries, and we're in the process of studying this, it is not that a refugee would receive any kind of monetary support, right? There is the issue related to costs. There is the issue, for example, regarding healthcare, which obviously comes at a cost, but it's not that refugees receive any kind of personalized support, and they're allowed to work. So, and Venezuelans, whether refugees or migrants, they come to work, right? So again, I think it will be about giving them formal status and making sure that they have the incentives to actually join the formal sector, because that's another thing we need to keep in mind. Throughout the region, we have countries where the economies are made up by around 50% of the economy is made up by the informal sector, right? Xenophobia, yeah, and I think I can link that to Cartagena. From my point of view, so it's not just a technical position process, and it's not just a technical issue, and it's not just an issue that is dealt with by foreign ministries. I really think that this decision whether to apply Cartagena or not is a political decision, and it needs to be taken based on regional cooperation and agreement to sort of address the phenomena with the conjointly. Yeah.
Thank you, Feline. That's unfortunately all we have time for. No, that's great. Perfect. And I know you have more, and I hate to be, but we are now at 12:07 actually. So we do need to end this. But I do commend to you Feline's writings on migration policy in Latin America, and I would follow her if you are on Twitter and. You're not on Twitter, though, Feline, but I would follow what she's writing. And let me quickly, in 30 seconds, let me say the question of equivalency in professional titles matters a great deal. It's a subject that I'm sure we'll continue to debate. The transition from temporary to permanent migration status is something that matters a great deal. What happens when PTP and PEP ends for people? It's something that I know that Felipe and Roxana are looking at and their teams are looking at. So stay tuned. It is very high on their radar screen. And the question of donations, regional or not, who's donating? The country governments in the EU are donating, but they have tended to donate to countries rather than regionally, even though the appeals are regional. So it is, there are some complicated dynamics that need to be dealt with, and international institutions are trying to stand up their roles within this. Let me thank you for joining us. Thank you especially to our speakers, phenomenal speakers. Thank you, and people who are really in mixed. Really actually leading on this issue in their countries. The audio will be up shortly at www.migrationpolicy.org/events later this afternoon. Please keep an eye out for the report we have coming out in January from Migration Policy Institute and other things that we'll have coming next year as well. And you can look out our migration information source articles as well. And we look forward to staying in touch with all of you. And if any reporters on the line that would like to follow up, you can call Michelle Middlestad at 202-266-1910. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to further conversations about this very important issue. Thanks so much.